We have to get rid of
There, 35 years ago, when I started working with native plants, it was very small scale and everything was local.
Does it
Yeah,
work
good.
now?
Yep,
Okay.
thanks. And now there's a lot more information, but unfortunately, and awareness and interest, which is great. Unfortunately, coming along with that interest and awareness is a lot of marketing. And marketing, in some ways, can be synonymous with bad information. And so there's a ton of bad information out there surrounding native plants. For the last 10 years or so, I kind of took the aloof approach with native plants, like, I don't really have to market them anymore. I don't have to promote them anymore. It's already happening and it's great. Then I started to hear the stuff that people were promoting and thought, no, I have to keep presenting information and ideas, because I didn't like a lot of the stuff I was hearing regarding cultivars and regarding genetic integrity on these plants, where they come from, how far away they're coming from. And so those are some of the basic things that I feel it's important to constantly remind people about in terms of defining those things, explaining them, and then talk about how our industry, the nursery industry, seems to be very welcoming of native plants, but in fact, they very much undermine the goals and the values of native horticulture, which are ecological goals in general. And then how and why to grow native plants from seed. And that's really all of these can fall into the keep it simple part, but I'll try to reiterate that as we go. So the first few slides is just a little bit of setting the table with information. Native, we get that question a lot. I usually tell people, don't worry too much about it. Just think of it in terms of a map. And, you know, whether if someone says to you, are you native to Central New York? Yeah. Okay. Are you native to Liverpool? Well, you know, maybe I'm over here and not here. Native plants are the same way. A native plant may be native to the Northeast, or it may be native to New York State, or it may be native to Oneida County, or it may be native to one watershed. We don't really have a lot of that really small scale native endemism here in this part of the country, but out west, you see a lot of that. Here we have very wide distribution for our plants. And those roosters back there. So we tend to have these wide distributions of native plants. I mean, think about gray dogwood or sumac or red maple. If you drive from here to the Carolinas, you'll see those plants all the way. And so when we talk about defining native, we're talking about how long it's been native in a region. Is it recently introduced or not? Generally, we talk about sort of pre-development, pre-industrialization, pre-population explosions in terms of the time factor. For the space factor, we talk about where this plant naturally occurs, not where it's been introduced or where it has spread to. On the other hand, we have to allow for the fact that plants have always moved around over time. And guess what? They still do, although it's getting harder for them. And then as habitats are fragmented. And then the ecology of a plant is important in determining whether it's native. Does this plant have perceivable, observable interactions with all kinds of other native organisms? That's a very strong indicator this is a native species. So we can look at where it grows, how long it's been growing there, and what its role is, what its function is in the ecosystem. I left this part in about traits because it was part of another presentation, but I kind of still like to remind people that specifically as traits are concerned, we tend to look at plant traits as the things we like about plants, the pretty stuff. It's a beautiful color, it has nice texture, it does well in the wind, it's a beautiful plant in the shade, softens up a dark corner of a landscape. Traits generally are clues for us to understand what a plant wants or needs. And that's because the plant trait is expressing something that the plant has evolved into. So a plant that maybe we say this plant's great, it likes moisture. Well, that's a plant that we can presume has come from the wetland environment. Plants that are leggy. We see this a lot with prairie perennials. A lot of those prairie perennials that get tall, they've evolved in these dense matrix landscapes of the prairie, where they have lots of species growing together in a perennial meadow. So all these traits that we reach for in plants should be telling us something about how to grow this plant, what the plant wants, where to grow it, where not to grow it, things like that. Drought tolerance in the plant. We don't really deal with too much of that where we live, although maybe a little bit more, but all of those traits are telling us something about a plant. And then the main parameters that we look for with plants, the primary ones, are light and moisture. For most plants, if you can get a handle on what it likes for light, versus not light, and moisture versus not moisture, those two gradients are the main ones you have to worry about to make a plant happy. And trial and error is great. You know, most plants are very forgiving. So if it wilts, move it. You know, if it needs more water, put it somewhere that's wetter. Move them around, move them around, move them around. They will live and they'll be happy. You know, so those are the primary ones. The secondary ones, maybe color, size. Those are things that are more about landscape type roles and uses. So as far as roles go, the main one that I think of is the ecological interactions that a plant has. Non-native plants may have ecological roles in landscapes where they're not from, or they may not. And if a non-native plant has a very active role in an environment and a native plant has the same role, you know, I'm always going to say, well, we should be using the native one. It's just simply opportunity cost. If we choose to use a non-native plant, then we can't also be using a native plant in that choice, in that moment, in that spot in your landscape. So the opportunity cost is an important idea from economics, which basically says if you're doing this, you can't be doing that at the same time. And in ecology, it's very true too. If you have one tree that you're going to plant in your yard and you choose to plant a crabapple, you're not planting fill in the blank, you know, a little dogwood or something like that. Small trees are another group that when people say, I really want a nice, cute native small tree, like it's a short list. It's a very, very short list for where we live. So that's one thing with roles too, is the opportunity cost, that every plant that we put in the ground, we're making a choice, which also means that we're choosing to not plant something else at that point. And then we have the physical role, which sometimes gets forgotten. When you work with erosion control people on projects, they're the ones that are mostly talking about the physical role a plant has in the environment. Shoreline stabilization, bank stabilization, keeping soils in place, shading, habitats, those are generally physical roles. You know, but they're all sort of ecological in nature if they relate to another organism's success. And then a couple of more things that's important, you know, the species. When I was studying ecology, we talked a lot about what a species was. And after a while, you just pull back and you say, wait a minute. We all kind of have a pretty good idea what a species is. But it's important to pay attention because more and more and more in horticulture, the species is getting dropped from the names of plants. And people don't really understand anymore what a species is, because a plant used to have a genus and a species, Cornus sericea. So Cornus being the genus for dogwood, sericea being the species, the specific epithet, if you like the nomenclature. Now often you'll see plants called, you know, Cornus Arctic Fire or something like that. And so, or Monarda Jacob Klein. Where's the species name? People don't really care anymore. They don't really know that information. It's getting lost in horticulture. So I think it's important to pay attention a little bit to what a species is. And, you know, basically in science, it has been defined, in botanical science, a species has been defined as organisms that will mate with each other and not really with other closely related organisms. Although then you get into hybridizations, the oaks hybridize a lot. So that's not a solid definition. But essentially you can see my own sense of what a species definition is. And then genetic diversity is another one that gets thrown around a lot. It was kind of popular for people to talk about that 20 years ago. I don't hear people talking about it as much anymore in horticulture, specifically native horticulture. Why? Because the cultivars are all clones. They're 100% equal, the same DNA. There's zero genetic diversity in the cultivar world, zero. Every single plant is a clone of every single other plant. That's very, very important because it means that if you have that type of homogeneity, you have zero genetic diversity. Every single plant that you can buy at a garden center that has these around it, the Jacob Klein quotes, identical to every single other one with the same name everywhere in the country, everywhere in the world. Europe, a lot of times you'll see these same plants in Europe. When you grow plants from seed, you get genetic diversity. You get crossing of some kind, depending on how diversely the seed has been collected, that will have some factor, but in general, when you grow things from seed, you have genetic diversity, you have outcrossing, and you mix the gene pool up for that species in a way that over time and space should be a positive direction for that thing, that species, that organism. And you have to remember, with a plant like Lobelia or Monarda or Rudbeckias or any of these native perennials that we like to grow, penstemons, remember, they're reproducing every year, okay? For humans or oak trees that might take a long time to start reproducing, you know, the human species, each human being doesn't reproduce every year for its whole life, but native perennial plants are reproducing every year. So their ability to recombine and upload all this new data that they get each year, the successful reproductions are the ones that are constantly sharpening up their strategy for survival. That's how they improve. And now imagine doing that for, in some cases, 20 million years. So that's why we want to capture as much of that DNA as possible by growing these plants from seed, because the only way that you get that passed down is from seed. When you start cloning something, you immediately stop allowing that process to happen. And now everything's the exact same. Big problem in native horticulture. We have to fight it, and that's what we do. A couple of things in the industry, that's the cloning part. And you can see the reasons, if I didn't make that clear. Why does our industry want to clone plants? They love the uniformity. It's great for marketing. It allows for branding and proprietary sales, royalties. That's why plants got expensive at the same time as the cultivar craze, because of royalties and marketing. It's bad stuff. Not good for native horticulture. It's fine if you're in business and your goal is to have a huge horticultural enterprise and make lots of money off branding, but it's not great for all the ecological stuff that goes on in the background. So again, zero genetic diversity. The model in horticulture that supports all this is basically antithetical to the idea of local and regional adaptation in horticulture. It's pretty much one or the other, can't be both. So, and it's also loaded with chemicals. That's the reason that I got out of the large scale horticulture business, was because they spray everything all the time. Those nurseries are just getting sprayed with poisons every day. It's disgusting. And that's because they're growing in huge quantities in enclosed spaces during the winter, and then even out in the blocks in the summer when the plants are outside. Those plants are getting a fungicide treatment, they're getting pre-emergent herbicides, they're getting insecticide treatments, they're getting, you name it. Now, growth regulators are in all the plants that are sold horticulturally. Growth regulators, hormone regulators, they're designed, it's like something out of a Ray Bradbury novel. They're designed to make the plants grow short and stocky with short spaces between the nodes, so that you don't have to have human beings employed to prune the plants. So this has been going on for years in horticulture, growth regulators, and they're nasty. But that's all stuff that's going on behind the scenes. And it all came along with this desire to have cultivars and eliminate genetic diversity in plants. That's really the whole thing about it. So this is why we're basically a seed grown nursery. That is our goal, to grow as much as possible from seed that we can. Every year we try to collect seed locally of as many plants and species as we can. And we have what we call the yellow tag program in the nursery. Our yellow tags in flats or pots indicate that this is a local seed source for this group of plants. The only way you can get all that genetic history and information and success built into this plant is by allowing it to be grown from seed. That's the only way you can capture it all. Not to mention it's how it works in nature. And I hear lots of people say that it's expensive or hard to grow plants from seed. It's really not. It's by far the cheapest way to grow plants, is to throw a bunch of seed in a tray and just wait. It's basically free. These are some of the little babies that we grow. You can come up and check these out after, but these are all what we call overwintered plants. And overwintered plants are plants that we grew at least 1 year previously. Sometimes it's 2 years, but these are all just last year's seedlings from seed. This is a little red twig dogwood plug from seed. Usually these are grown from cuttings because they root well. And then this year, as they go into year 2, we'll give them a little trim and put them in a larger container. The trim helps them bush out, and then we have a healthier, bigger plant. And these are some milkweeds. And if I showed you this, We hear it all the time in the nursery. Well, why would I buy a dead plant? We say, well, you're not buying it. It's April or not even. But these are the roots on an overwintered milkweed, and this is swamp milkweed, and then we will pot those up when as soon as we can work the soil. You can see the yellow on these tags; they've faded in the sunlight, but these are yellow. These are I brought all yellow tag species to show you. Afterward, feel free to come on up there and handle them. They're really fun to see what they look like and feel like. The reason I like to show people that is you don't get to see seedlings enough in life. If you're a plant person and you're a nursery buyer, nursery customer, nursery shopper, you don't get to see that stuff. But we like people to see it in our nursery because it's what we do. And I like people to see it wherever they get a chance. It's really important for people to see young plants in production. I thought about if I knew how to do this on my computer, I would have put a little circle with a line through it on that little part there, this part at the bottom. Not because I don't like those sources, but at this point, I just feel like you should just try it. Just do it and try it, learn from doing it. It's not hard to get seed to grow. You don't really need to do that much research. There's like 3 main ways that we make seed germinate. None of them are complicated, but just make them come up. And you'll learn from doing, if you like to grow plants. You don't really need to belabor it too much. It works. People should know about this resource just because it's a nice comprehensive one. And we generally use this to determine if a plant is truly native in New York State or not. A lot of plants that people think are native in New York State, this group, which is they're kind of a demanding and strict group of botanists, and they have a very high standard for calling something native in New York State. And so if there's evidence that a plant might have been moved into the state in modern times by Native Americans or other ways, they will sort of classify it as not quite native in New York, maybe native in Ohio. So if a plant's native in Ohio and it's not native in New York, what are we talking about? You know, we're talking about a couple of crowflights or something. So it's hard to say. And I don't want people to get hung up too much with whether something's native in New York or not, if it's native close by. It's important to have a regional viewpoint, I think, in these things. And we can work with any type of situation. If someone says we're doing a project and we want all species native to Tompkins County, fine, we have that, we can do that. They say we want all species that are at least native in New York State, fine, we know that information's out there, it's knowable. Generally, we don't see too much of that anymore. We just see that people are looking for plants that are grown in a healthy way, in a clean way, that are native in this quadrant of the US, and that do well here, and that attract pollinators here at the right time. And that's the demand we're seeing the most of in the nursery. You know, I think it's good to know that information, and it's knowable. And this is the kind of place if you really want to get into the details. But the first thing that's important to understand is the difference between something that's native in North America or not. And the other important thing to be aware of is, are we talking about a species or a cultivar? Is this plant cloned, or is it grown from seed and has genetic diversity? Those are really, really important. I don't know what you did there, Bill, but sorry. I know, yeah.
Yeah, okay, try it.
Yeah, it's good. Thank you. So this is just an example of a page from the New York Flora Atlas. So it's showing you, the lower circle is showing the status as native, and then it gives a state rank, which is usually more information than people want or need, unless they're professional botanists. But also species and genus and family and all these things. And then the map on the lower right is showing you presence or absence by county in the state, which is kind of fun. And that's usually based on herbarium records from the past, where botanists used to go out and explore a lot, or now maybe just records that people are recording digitally saying, hey, we, GPS this plant here. But in the old days, those maps would have been based on actual plant collections that were stored in herbariums. And so one that we like to point out to people, I love Echinacea purpurea. It's a great plant. It's a very important garden perennial that attracts lots of creatures. Technically not native in New York State. I'm not gonna beat it up over that. It's just, if someone said we want to only use New York State native plants, I would say to them, well, okay, do you not want to use echinacea? Okay, you don't, that's fine. Just to have the knowledge, their choice, your choice, it's just important to know. And you can see the presence absence map. So for this one, those would be what we would call an escaped population or a naturalized population. So it's presumably if they're showing up on a county map like that, it means that it's not just someone's garden, that they're living somewhere in the wilds in those counties. And just one last thing about the Flora Atlas, those top, let's see if I can make this work. There you go. Right up here, you can enter a genus or a common name or species. So it's very searchable. Once you get the hang of it, it's pretty easy. So this is what I call big horticulture. This is what horticulture looks like in the US today. And to make sure people understand the scale we're talking, these are tractor trailers right there, 53 feet long. And those get loaded and shipped to garden centers all over the country. And this would be in the middle of the country, not by coincidence, but because it allows them to broadcast the same exact clonal plant material to every garden center in the country. I'm not making this stuff up. This is really what happens. But this is what I call big horticulture, because big horticulture, just like farming, it's the same exact thing that happened with food farming, where we had massive growth of large scale food farms. And then people kind of thought, should we be doing that? Maybe we might want to have small scale local farms that grow things a little cleaner and have a little more interesting offerings and keep things local. It's the exact same thing with native horticulture. Only here we're at the big farm scale still with horticulture. And so it leads to monoculture. That's not a theory. That is what happens because it's based on volume and uniformity. And all the things that go along with monoculture, like we talked about briefly in the beginning, in terms of all the spraying systems and the spraying patterns. And also the marketing, you see all the, the ads that we see, I don't think I have one of them in here, but the ads that we see all the time in the nursery journals and magazines that we get unsolicited that come to our mailbox are promoting like, you've got to have the new incredible hydrangea because there's going to be 200 million mentions of this plant in the spring advertising program around the country. And if you don't have it, your garden center is going to be missing out. And when I read that, I think, that's what we're up against, but that's not what we do. So we don't worry about it. But that's telling me how those companies in that industry how they're marketing their values, which are uniformity and large scale. It's just all it is. So this is what those greenhouses look like on the inside. And we're just trying to get people to think differently and change how we do it. And it's not new stuff, it's old stuff. The things that we're trying to promote are old things. This is how it was for a long time and how it used to be. Some of us in here, myself included, are old enough to remember when you'd go to nurseries and not garden centers, because they didn't exist, nurseries. And a nursery would mean that you were seeing something unique and specific to that nursery person. What they wanted to grow, what they were able to propagate in-house. They weren't getting distributor truckloads all the time. So the language is interesting to me too. I see other garden centers promoting things like, what they promote in their advertising is what arrived this week. When I see that, I think, it's not a nursery anymore. Those are and that's why they're called garden centers. They're not growing anything. And it's not to beat up on them. The reason I mention that is to try to help people see the difference between two very different systems. And if you're interested in native plants are by definition local. They're a local and regional commodity. And they don't really lend themselves very well to national distribution of the same type. That's the reason I'm bringing that all up. I think it's important to discern. So we're just going to do a little bit of trait homework here and try to explain how some of the traits that we enjoy in horticulture have an ecological role. So one of my favorite ones is the compound inflorescence. So the compound inflorescence, we instinctively as gardeners love it because it means lots of flowers crammed into one head. And so the compound inflorescence, if anyone doesn't know what it means, it's really just lots of little flowers aggregated into something that looks like a big flower. The classic example are these in the daisy family, the aster family. Lots of tiny little flowers All these little bumps are individual flowers or florets, and they're aggregated into a head that's supposed to look like one big flower. Even these, what we call the petals on these are actually the ray flowers. So this is just an exaggerated flower bract at the bottom of this massive fake head. And the whole strategy there is just to advertise to get pollinators to come. And if you're the big showy flower that's easiest to see, you're more likely to get pollinators to come. Why do you want pollinators to come? Reproduction, seed, making seed. All these strategies are about making seed. And we tend to think of these as big, beautiful ornamental structures in nature. Even the skunk cabbage is a compound inflorescence on the inside. Those tiny little protuberances are all little flowers. Each of these is a little flower. Not a great photo, I know, but it's usually like 37 degrees in the dark, wet, muddy shade when I'm taking skunk cabbage. And that's just another one. And so you little flies and things that come in and sneak into that little space and pollinate inside there. But the compound inflorescence is a great example of a trait that really reveals an ecological strategy. And so that's why we see so many of the plants that people like as pollinator plants in the prairie environment or the meadow environment having the compound inflorescence, because they are pollinator plants. It's what they do. Fruit is another obvious trait that we tend to look for in plants. And, you know, sometimes it's deliberate that we're thinking, I want a plant that has this fall color in the form of showy fruit. Magnolias do it, viburnums do it, Staphylia on the bottom left is a great plant for the lime soils up around here. Grows in the cliffs a lot around here. And then Virginia creeper, a great native vine, grows all over the country. There is not a better vine for shade in difficult sites, steep slopes in the full shade, that will provide not only color, but fruit for birds. We grow it. It's one of those plants that people make fun of us for growing, like sumac. And we usually just kind of go, yeah, you're right. Yeah. So, but, you know, then, you know, we'll get someone that wants 100 of them for a shade plant. That's great. That's why we grow it. Sumac is, I don't think I have it on this, in this series, but the sumac is another one that is a great fruit plant that most people don't think about using in a landscape. And again, does it belong in the front beds by your entryway? No. But if you have a property like so many of us do here in upstate New York, where you have some room and you have some space that might be kind of always a tension between wild and tame, that's a great place to allow some premium bird habitat to develop. Those back borders, that's what they used to be called. And that's a great place to let something like the sumac do its thing. But the fruits, all these fruits, it's just an adaptation to dispersal. Again, it's about seed. It's really not the fruit that the plant is worried about so much as how it's going to disperse its seed. And the seed is getting dispersed by attracting something to come into the fruit. So these traits that we think are ornamentally attractive is really a strategic way for these plants to make sure their seed gets dispersed. These will be blooming maybe like next week.
Where are they?
This is Marsh marigold, Caltha palustris, sometimes called cowslip. And I never know if that's cow's lip or cowslip. I don't know if anybody knows, but either one is kind of funny. Cowslip, they slip on those. Is that the idea? It is a strange common name. It is. Caltha palustris is the botanical name, and these bloom really early and before the trees really leaf out. And the reason for this is because these plants, this is Caltha making seed. The reason for this is because they tend to grow in these deciduous wetlands, and if they waited too long, they wouldn't have enough light because the trees would all be full of leaves. So what they do is they have tipped their flowering cycle. They've evolved over time, and they've passed that info down by seed into these muddy flats where they grow, ditches, wetlands, and they've dialed it in so that they are able to flower before they lose the overhead light from the deciduous overstory. If things were to change and the trees were to leaf out earlier, for example, it would be the job of the seed of Calpa palustris to record that information every year. And eventually you would see these plants would start to flower earlier. They would do that. That's what they've already done. We don't have to speculate if they're able to do that. They've already done that. It's not common for a plant to bloom in April in central New York. Marsh marigold does that, and it's really because of where it grows. So these are traits where we can learn from the trait something about the ecology of the plant, and we can also be sure that these plants are successfully recording that information and using it to their benefit. That's something we don't have to speculate on because we can see it in action. Another trait that we tend to be aware of as gardeners is growth rate. You know, you put something in the ground and it does nothing for 3 years and it's frustrating. Or you put something in the ground and it goes crazy and you either play defense on it or you are happy if it's growing quickly. I mean, usually that's a good thing. But in the nursery industry, the fast ones are the ones that really are ideal for nursery growers. And so, you know, there's all kinds of terminology for that, turnaround time, the quick turn, they call them quick turn plants, something you can take into the nursery and put it in a pot and 4 weeks later it's ready for sale. Most nurseries are going to say, sign me up for that one. As opposed to the trilliums, which might take 7 years to bloom from seed. And most nurseries will say, no, thank you, except enter the plant diggers who are going to sell those plants on the open market. And so we run into that problem. Why are people digging up trillium and wildflowers from the woods? Because they're slow growers, because they don't work well in nursery cultivation. So all these traits really do have sort of kick down effects in the nursery industry and in the world of horticulture. If you see trilliums and bloodroots and all these, what we call wildflowers, you see those sold cheap around here or anywhere, they're definitely dug from the wild. They're not propagated. They're just very slow growers. Bloodroots, hepaticas, trilliums, cohosh, they tend to be slow, very slow. Some of them we've learned to work with from seed and we found they're very fast. Actaeas are very fast from seed. We get them to sometimes flower in year 2 from seed. Wild ginger we've grown from seed and got some of those to flower in year 2. Yeah.
Just want to be, I would really clarify, if you see one that you think it's dug from the wild, you shouldn't buy it because digging from the wild is not a good thing.
Yeah. Yes. Let me elaborate just a little. I don't want to make it a sermon on that, but in general, in the nursery industry, it's generally frowned upon to dig things from the wild and sell them. And the reason that we don't like that is not a competition thing. It's because plants that are dug from the wild often will die at a high rate. And so you're essentially at some high percentage taking a plant out of the wild and killing it and making money on that. But you also get disturbances in those habitats where people are going in and ripping things out of the woods. And you also have stories of plant population reductions, and in some cases, plants being at great risk of extirpation. So a population disappearing, not the species going extinct, but a certain population disappearing because of people digging them from the wild. You see this all over the Appalachian Mountains with all the wildflowers. We get lists from people, you know, this long telling us I've got all these things for 49 cents a division. And those are not garden divisions. So that's an industry. That's an industry. That's the reason I mentioned it with trillium. Something like liatris is the opposite. We grow those from seed, and you can also buy those as nursery grown bulbs or corms, and they're very cheap plants. And it's one of the reasons that liatris has become a very popular plant in horticulture. Is it's very easy to grow. So the growth rates do have a relationship with what you end up seeing as a nursery customer.
Doesn't the liatris spread like crazy though?
Liatris will drop seed and you'll see seedlings, but they don't. If you let them go for a year or two, you might see 1,000 seedlings under one of those plants. You will not see 1,000 liatris come up.
So it's not invasive.
No, definitely not. I like to save the word invasive for a non-native species. I mean, it's a little bit of a semantic thing. There are definitely some native plants that are very aggressive and sometimes not in a good way. But I like to try to reserve that word invasive for non-native species, just so that people don't get confused. Yeah.
They look a lot like loosestrife.
Yeah, that's what I was
A
gonna
lot of
say.
people confuse those two.
Yeah.
Purple loosestrife.
Walk around lakes.
They look enough like loosestrife to confuse people, I guess they do. And sometimes you'll see these little pamphlets where people will say, for these top 10 invasive species, here's some native plants you can try instead. The problem with some of those look-alike ideas is if they come from very different habitats and they won't work in the same way. This plant, Liatris, will grow almost anywhere. But definitely very different from the loosestrife, not at all related in any way, except that it's a flowering plant. So the dug from the wild thing, I just caution people, if you want to do that, if you want to buy plants that are dug from the wild, I'm not here to criticize you. I'm here to try to make sure people understand what it means if someone's selling really precious plants really cheap. It's an indication, because those are not easy to grow. So this is a part here about growing plants from seed. And as far as the keep it simple and keep it real part, we like to make sure that people know we're not just saying you should do this or that. We want people to make sure that people see that it's really doable and it's really fun to grow plants from seed. And for, I would say, about 2/3 of the things we grow, they're pretty easy. So these are, I won't bore you with all the names on all these, but this is just sort of a visual to show you some of the different textures of the seed that we handle, you know, the sort of the little dry, light, fluffy ones, and the coarse seed heads, the red buds that are up on the top near the left, which are like a little bean pod. There's just all kinds of shapes and sizes that we deal with. And each of those might need some different cleaning techniques by hand, or when we store them, different storage techniques. Some want to be stored dry, some want to be stored wet or damp. The acorns like to be stored in some sort of soil-like medium, and you can see those radicals are just poking out right there, getting ready to pop. And you can see the wet soil clinging to the acorn. That's how we store them. Some of the oaks like to germinate immediately when they fall and hit the ground in the fall. As soon as we have a little damp fall weather, they will start to germinate and try to root in for the fall. Another group of oaks will stay dormant until the spring. So they have different storage requirements depending. So there's a little bit of information that you'll want to get and learn, but in general, trial and error will give you some successes almost no matter what. This is a good old friend that I used to do a lot of seed collecting with down in the Pine Barrens of New Jersey. And I really just keep this in there because I like to see his picture. But I remember his little wry laugh that he always had all the time. And he was doing that in that photo. Kelly was from North Dakota, and he was a great seed collector and propagator when I used to work down at Plantsmen Nursery years ago. So this is back home at Plantsmen, and this is Bridget cleaning seed. And cleaning seed is fun. It's kind of like mowing the lawn. You know, the first time or two, you're like, oh, this is great. It's nice. I'm outside. It's spring. Nothing to worry about. And then by the third time, you know, you're, oh, don't I have a kid that can mow the lawn? And cleaning seed is a little bit like that because it's really fun and interesting, but it also is tedious and time consuming. Yeah. And it just takes time. You have to put the time in. But some of that is the scale that we're growing at, and some of it is because we're trying to grow more and more things that aren't that easy, pushing a little bit in that direction. So you'll see here next, I'll show you some of the basic sort of guidelines, paperwork part of it, that how we track what things need, and that's kind of important too. This is really a very small scale photo. There might only be, 30 or 40 little seeds or fruits in those jars, but which usually we would have, for most of the things we grow now, we would have more than that in there. But that's just an example to show if we have a seed that comes as a fruit, that we will sometimes just drop them in water and let the fruit rot, and then the seed will sink to the bottom. The challenge there is you don't want to let them sit in there too long. So sometimes instead of just the sitting in water method, we'll just kind of put them in water. Let them soak for half a day or something, and then macerate it by hand or just stir it around and get that fruit to break apart and speed that along. And sometimes we'll use the old blender with duct tape on the blades. But that always makes me a little nervous when people are doing that, mostly for the seed, but for them too. No, it's a little extreme. When I used to work in California, I started to experiment with taking seed flats and burning them because there's certain plants that need fire to germinate. And so we would have all these substitutes for fire. And finally, I just thought, why don't we just burn it? And so we stuffed all these seed flats, we made little wooden seed flats and we stuffed them with pine needles and set them on fire. And it was really fun. And we got a few of them to germinate, but those are much more complicated. We don't have very complex germination species here in the East because our climate is very moderate and very mellow. We have seasons, we have a long period that plants have adapted and evolved to like seed just sort of naturally, slowly soaking over the winter and breaking down. You can just picture what's going on underground with all that seed. You know, the snow is melting, it's sitting under the blanket of snow, it's wet, it's cold. It's basically like in your fridge, which is where some of these would be stored. And then as spring comes, you know, that last little bit of moisture soaking in, and then you raise the temperature naturally of the soil. That's a pretty relatable and sort of intuitive process for seed going through a period of breakdown and waking up. Out west, you have all these crazy cycles of 6 months dry, 6 months wet, fire, crazy stuff that seed has had to adapt to there and evolve to. And it has. We don't really see that so much here. Those are bayberries on the top right. And on the bottom, those are our bayberry seedlings. So we grow that plant, we grow from seed that has been pretty much an easy plant to grow. And just adorable little plants to grow from seed. But so if people don't know this plant, it has a waxy seed coat. That blue wax is really fragrant and beautiful and is often used in candles and soaps and things like that. But of course, ecologically, that wax is a water inhibitor. So it's probably trying to keep the seed from rotting. And then after a while, if it's wet enough, it will break down. Or you put it in a blender, just get rid of it. Cheat, that's a cheat code there. So then you get into stratification. So after you've cleaned seed, now you're stratifying the seed. Stratifying seed, I don't know if I like that word. It's too complicated. Stratification should be called treatment. It really should just be called seed treatment. It's a range of conditions that you're giving the seed based on what you know that it needs. So if you think the seed likes to have a short period of time cold and wet, you throw it in the fridge with a little moisture, like bottom right. Sometimes there are books, of course, now you can find all this online. There are basically compendiums of information where it's like you can just look it up and find out what the seed wants. You don't have to guess. It doesn't mean it'll always work, but it's a good head start. So some of these species that we work with want not only a cold stratification in the winter, then they want a warm period in the summer, and they're still not germinating. Then they want another cold period, and they're still not germinating. Then they want a warm period, and they're still not germinating. We have 3-year cycles of that, but some of the viburnums do that. But it's essentially the same thing as a plant that just wants a cold stratification, except it's just demanding and it wants a few of them. And that's the cycle. So, okay, we'll give it to you. So sometimes what we'll do with those plants is we'll put them in like sandbox environments out in the nursery, and we'll just let them sit there and sleep for a few years. And then one day you check that box and they've germinated. And that means they got enough of the warm, cold that they wanted. And those are just conservative strategies. It's just a conservative approach to germination, as opposed to the plants where pretty much all you have to do is show them the hose and they germinate. So you get all kinds. It's just like people. You get all kinds, and you just have to find out what they want. Generally, it's the same thing every year for most plants. If that's what they want, that's what they want every year. They're not moody that way.
Can you comment on the swamp milkweed stratification process?
Yeah, I think swamp milkweed is what we call a 60-day. And so that's shorthand for 60-day cold stratification, or cool moist, I should say, not cold, cool moist. Cool moist stratification is you take the seed, clean it best you can. You don't have to clean it, but we usually do. And then you put it in a bag of some kind of soil type medium. You can use anything. You can use sawdust, wood shavings, you can use soil that's not really, as long as you know it's not like funky and full of weird plant diseases and things. I wouldn't use like old recycled soils for seed. But generally you can use sterile mixes like perlite. You can use if you have a bag of old potting soil in your garage and it seems to be clean and it doesn't smell bad, you can use that stuff. You can use sand. You're just looking for a substrate at that point that's going to help spread the moisture out in that bag, essentially. So whatever works well. We use a little soil and a little perlite usually, nice fluffy mix. And the key is you want no water on the bottom and you don't want the top to be dry. So that's how we know that it's not too dry or too wet. And then swamp milkweed, I believe, is a 60-day. And most native species break down as like 30-day, 60-day, or 90-day. And obviously they're not aware of what a month is. So that's arbitrary. Those are arbitrary numbers. It's kind of a small, medium, and large idea for them. But we generally find that if something is a 60-day, if we just give it 30, it's not enough. So whether that's really where those lines are, hard to say. Yeah.
I had the butterfly weed, it's like the swamp milkweed, but it's orange.
Yeah.
And did I get lucky? Because I just put it in an envelope, left it in the cellar during the winter. Then in the spring, I planted it in little pots and it grew, and I planted it outside and it grew bigger.
Came up.
Did I get lucky?
Well, offhand, the question was about the orange flowered milkweed, the butterfly milkweed. Which I like to call butterfly milkweed and not butterfly weed, because it is all about promoting these things. So like Joe Pye weed, terrible name, I call it Joe Pye, which doesn't tell anyone anything about the plant Joe Pye, but still it's better than calling it a weed. That one, the orange milkweed, the butterfly milkweed, I don't remember what the stratification is on that, but I think we usually do stratify it. So were you storing it dry, the seed dry?
In an envelope.
Yeah, so that's the trial and error part. You can always throw some seed in a pot and start watering it and see what happens, and you may get something to come up. Because remember, when we're talking about how all these plants are recording their successes and their failures in the form of DNA that they breed with another plant and they make seed and that gets passed on. It's not all 100% successful. So some seed might be lacking the dormancy mechanisms that most of that seed has for that species. So it's complicated stuff. In general, you're lucky if that plant doesn't die. At any stage, it's prone to dying. So it's good. The first place I saw the orange milkweed doing really well was in the sand dunes in coastal New Jersey.
Wow.
And that's when I realized we were growing it all wrong because we were watering it. It doesn't like water and it doesn't like clay. So this is what our fridges look like at the nursery in the winter. It's fun because every now and then what you'll do is you look in one of those bags and you'll see all the little seedlings that have sprouted. And that means, okay, we went too long on that one, but let's get it out of the fridge and get them in a flat and cover up the roots and try to get everything happy and let them grow. And usually that works if you're careful. That can be a fun stage to see all the little white roots in the bag, but it's also at this point in my life, it's sort of terrifying because I feel like, okay, these plants, I've already done a bunch of growing in the fridge. Now we have to convince them that they belong in the greenhouse, and it gets complicated for them. For a few days, it's transitional. This is one of our cheat sheets for note-taking on seed handling, seed treatment, stratification. And so, some of these here, let's see, do we have Asclepias tuberosa on there? Next page, I guess. But you'll see generally 30 to 45 days, 90 days, 60 to 90 days. You'll see in the middle there, Allium tricoccum, that's wild leeks. Cold, warm, just means 2 years of the basic thing. And then there's 90, Actea pachypoda up here. 90 days or cold, warm, so immediately. So that's kind of, at that point, we're guessing what it wants. We're just trying a few things. That means we've had trouble with that plant. If we're noting that there's 2 or 3 versions of reality, then We're struggling with it at that point. Notes about where things are from, notes about where the seed was collected. This is all in a spreadsheet, obviously, too. This is printed from that, but so that information is kept, and that's what we're trying to do every year. Is to sharpen that information up. And so here's one that's just, let's see if I can find you a fun one. 60 days light. That means after we take it out of storage, we sow that seed on the surface and don't cover it. And that's frustrating when you learn that the hard way, is after you've gone the whole winter of storing a seed, spread it on a tray, bury it with soil, and then it doesn't come up, and then you find out that it just needed light. So you killed it. So that happens. It's sad. And whatever this one is, none, that's always fun when you have something that needs no help to germinate. That's pretty rare. But there's a few. And 30 days or 60 days, once you get the hang of it, you're just putting that seed in the fridge and then taking it out and sowing it. That's not hard. See if there's anything else on there. No, it's all the same stuff we've been talking about. And then sometimes what we'll do is we'll group those, like these are the 30-day ones, the 30 to 60, 60 to 90, just so that you're not having to take them all out to sort through them. Although I have found that it's nice to take them all out and sort through them sometimes, because you'll catch some that have germinated in there. And you have to remember there's really no light in there. So when they germinate in there, they become very, they get all scrawny and straggly, but they're just at that point they're really out of sync when they've germinated in a refrigerator. It's not good. So these are little baby hemlock seedlings, which we don't really successfully grow hemlocks to maturity from seed. We tried a couple of years, we've stopped. They're just hard to grow. They're not that hard to get them to germinate, but sometimes something's easy to germinate and hard to carry forward. We see that every year with a few things. But this section, I just thought it would be nice to show you some seedlings of plants, so you can see both what the mature plant looks like, which most of you probably know, but then also the seedling. And I just think the seedlings are really cute, so I like to show them. And most people don't get to see enough seedlings, is really the truth. I don't really know why I have this photo in here, except that at some point I probably was trying to show a basic greenhouse setup. And this was when we were putting hot water tubing under our benches. And we have found that does work well, because instead of any other sources of heat, we're basically putting it right under the trays. So it seems to be pretty direct. And yeah, that's all you need to know really about that photo. But that's probably taken in February or March, because nothing's up yet. Some of the seedling trays we work with. So the ones I showed you over here, these are all multiples of 50. This is what we call a 2-inch plug, this size. And there's 50 of them per tray. And they're short, they're 2 inches deep. Or like lumber, these are like 1.5 inches. And then these are 50s, but these are what we call 4-inch deep, 3.5. Or sometimes we call these tubulings, and that's this taller size. And so a lot of that will depend on if either the plant really wants more root room, then it goes in one of these, or it may just be that we know we're going to stick this plant into a larger pot at the next step. So we want to give it a little more depth to begin with. These are all 50s, multiples of 50 per tray. So when you look down the greenhouse and you see 200 trays, you start to have a sense of, okay, we have this many plants in storage, or we have 8 trays of swamp milkweed, so we know we have 400 of them if they're all alive. Before that size, we usually will be starting things in these types of trays where the cells are, maybe 3/4 of an inch diameter and about 1 inch deep or something like that. And this one in particular is 162. They make trays as small as 512. I think 512 cells in the same amount of space as those flats that are on the table. Those are teeny tiny. But these are the kinds of trays that are really fun to work with in a nursery that most people never really get their hands on. But if you do like to grow plants, anything that you might grow at home, if you grew 100 of something or 162 of something, it's great. You get to pot some of them up, give some to friends. Some are going to die. It's fine. You have a lot of plants in one tray. That's really the key with those. Sometimes we use what we call the common flat, which is no cells, no cell divisions in the tray, just a tray. You can use a baking sheet, anything, you know. We used to grow rhododendrons in the old Thai food takeout containers because we found that the little clear plastic lid over the top was essentially making a beautiful mini greenhouse. And the humidity was perfect. And one year we had something like 2,000 rhododendron seedlings in a container that was this big. And we weren't able to grow any of them on, but just seeing them germinate, it's fun. It's really fun to just learn, like something happened there that they liked, you know. This is geranium maculatum, our wild geranium. And yellow tag in the tray means that it was local seed source. Collected probably roadside, because where we live, these grow all over the roadsides. In the spring, you see them blooming. And then this plant has sort of like a nice tuberous base. So what you're seeing in the top of that flat, you know, there might be 40 seedlings. And we'll try to divide them out almost one for one. When we get into a plant that's more rhizomatous, we'll just maybe rip those into clumps. And then maybe if we pot them up at the next stage to a bigger pot, we might divide that clump again. And how much we divide them, how finely we divide them usually depends on how desperate we are for quantities. I'm gonna say. But as with all things, if we get greedy and try to divide too many, they tend to die. So, you know, you're trying to balance all that. And then for a lot of these plugs, the way we use them is, this is basically our bank, so that we think we have enough. These are, they look like Menarda didymas, yeah. Yellow tag again, so local seed source. Hard to find this plant locally from seed. So let's say we have 120 of them in the nursery at the time, and we think we're good for a while. We're not going to pop these up. We'll just sit on this tray for another month or so. And then we get an order from someone who wants 60 of them, and suddenly we feel like we're low again. So having these plugs sitting there is our way of keeping that cycle going as quickly as we can, and not having to rely on someone else to grow plants for us, and also not having to rely on plants that are grown from someone else's seed source somewhere from who knows where. So it's a certain amount of self-reliance that we like that way. Provenance, or people know that term in horticulture. Provenance is really the term for the genetic origin of the plant material, where the plant came from genetically. So if we see a, let's see what's right out here. Well, let's say, I think I saw some aronia by the front door on the way in. So let's say there's an aronia, a chokeberry, sitting in the landscape out front. And you ask them, well, where did that come from? Well, it came from Aspinall's nursery. Okay, well, where did they get it from? Oh, they got it from a wholesaler in Tennessee. Well, where did they get it from? Well, that seed was collected in the Carolinas. That's the provenance. It's the DNA. It's the origin of the plant biologically, not commercially, not where it was last handled, not where it was potted up into a container, not where it was germinated. It really has to do with where the seed originated. And that's important because in most cases as a nursery customer, you never know that. That's a zero. You will never, ever get that information, ever. I would challenge you to ask any place you buy plants, except for the ones that do this on purpose. And you won't even get an answer, let alone what the answer would be, because most people in horticulture don't think of it that way. They don't understand the question. They would tell you that it came from the Pride's Corners delivery truck. And that's not provenance. And that's fine, but it just means that the reason that I mentioned that is that if people don't understand it, that tells you how far we moved away from being aware of it, if they don't even understand what the question is. Now, it's generally a permanent thing. I mean, I don't know if analogies with people help in this case, because that's a little, it's different, because we're talking about millions and millions of years in a lot of cases with these plant populations, you know. So if we collect hemlock seed from a Syracuse forest, that population's been there at least, you know, tens of thousands of years and maybe millions of years, depending on where it is. But there are sycamore populations in the Potomac River drainage in Washington that appear to be the same populations that were there 160 million years ago. They appear to be unchanged in the Potomac River drainage. So Now you're talking real deep provenance at that. But we usually don't have things that have been here that long here because of glaciers where we live. But the real challenge of provenance is hard. You don't see it, it's invisible. So you're relying on having some understanding of that with where your plants are coming from, and most of the time you just won't get it. Those are little clematis virginianas. These are some of the milkweed plants that we grow. And it's really cute because the caterpillars will find them when they're this big. We've had people come to the nursery. We had a customer, I don't know if the person's in this room, I apologize, but it is a good story. We had someone that was coming to the nursery and taking the caterpillars off our plants and bringing them home, and we had to say, you know, we kind of want you to leave those here. But at least she wasn't squashing them or anything. But still, it's kind of fun. I love seeing them defoliate our milkweed plants because the milkweed plants will be fine. And it's really just amazing to think that a plant this big that the caterpillars will find it, or the butterflies will lay eggs on those. But they do, they really do. This is what these plants, those swamp milkweed plugs that are dormant on top right now, this is what they look like during the growing season. They get fast quickly. That's a 2.5 inch sort of rectangular pot. It's really not that different from the tubeling size. It's a little bit wider. But we love planting that size or even those plugs directly out in the landscape as long as there's some care going on in that landscape. If it's a kind of a careless landscape, then I would say the next size up is safer. But you can definitely get away with any plant that's going into a moist soil, like it's something damp, wetland type environment, or just a wet lawn type of bed. That size will be fine. The main risk with the smaller size containers is just that they dry out quicker because their roots only go down so far. So that's it. Other than that, those are viable plants. Those asters are as big as some of the ones you'll see garden centers selling in the 6-inch pot. And they're, you know, a fifth the size. You know, you see that, I don't know, we see it all the time. People will take a plug, stick it in a pot, and immediately put it out for sale. And you take it home and go to plant it, and it's just a plug in a pot of soil. So that's one of the things that you don't get when you have overwintered plants. That's what we are fighting against with the overwintered plants. Is, you know, they start growing suddenly once they get going. They don't need a lot of help to get going in the spring. These look like more clematis and elderberry on the right, I believe. Yeah, so left is clematis and on the right is elderberry. Definitely those kinds of plants can go out from that size into the landscape. They're fun to put in. That would be another little Monarda there. These are some of the 6-inch pots. So this is it for people that are a little anxious about, I don't really know if plug planting is for me. The 6-inch pot size is something that we love in the nursery because it's still smaller than a gallon, but we can grow a big perennial in that size. When people worry about root bound plants, it's really not an issue with perennials. When I take plants home from the nursery of root bound, I just rip the roots off the bottom. I never cut them or trim them or anything. And they never die from that. They're perennials, super easy. You can beat them up like that. When you get into certain trees or some shrubs, they may not like to be really handled roughly in the root zone. But even most native shrubs, elderberries, things like that, they want to grow. They just want to grow. Put them in the ground if they get a little moisture. The key is probably soaking. Probably the most important thing with any plant you put in the ground, soak it on the day of planting. And if you can give it water for anywhere from a few days to a few weeks afterward, at that point, they want to grow. And you have to remember, when you're buying a healthy plant, the roots are trying to grow almost immediately. So within a week, if you're a halfway attentive gardener, anything you plant, you should be able to tell that it's doing fine and on its own, you know, in most cases within a week. Now, if you're talking about ball and burlap trees or something like that, it's kind of the opposite. They can take a year before they put out any growth in the root zone. And you can be doing everything you should, and they'll just sit there. But for perennials and containers, shrubs and containers, they're actively growing. They want to grow. As soon as they get in the ground and have moist soil, those roots are trying to grow. This is a fun one, the hibiscus. A lot of people don't realize we have a native hibiscus in central New York, and it grows all over at Montezuma, but it grows in wetlands scattered about central New York, and I think it grows on the Cuga Inlet too. We see it there too, and I assume those are real populations, but it's just a nice photo to show you where it grows. This is a photo of Montezuma National Wildlife Refuge, and the seed heads in the upper left with seed next to them. That's a 60-day scarification. So that's different from stratification. Scarification means we have to break somehow the seed coat needs to be disturbed. Throw it in you can sand those. We usually, for scarification, we will usually use like we'll put down a sheet of sandpaper and we'll just rub them over that for a little bit. You're just trying to create some surface area on that seed coat that will allow water in, and then the water will break it. Yeah. I would assume the way that happens in the wild is that seed might sit for more than a year in the muds. And as those muds are moving around and you have freeze thaw cycles, it's enough to just, all you need is a nick in that seed coat. If we didn't care how quickly these would germinate, then we wouldn't necessarily run them through sandpaper, but we like to ask them to not wait too long if they are willing. It's kind of a deal we like to make, but you know, it really doesn't take much for this seed. If you looked at that seed, it doesn't scream resistance to you. Sometimes, like when you see the bayberry, that thick layer of wax on the bayberry, you know, I would not be surprised if bayberries might take 3 or 4 years in the wild to germinate. And that's the other thing, is in the wild, we don't know for a lot of these things how long they're staying dormant in the soil. And it's probably a rolling inventory. Some seed each year is germinating and some seed each year is staying dormant. And that's a great strategy for those plants to not spend it all at once. So there's the liatris. They really look like a grass when they're germinating, except the giveaway that they're a dicot, not a monocot, is they have these two cotyledons at the bottom. That tells you it's a dicot. If it were a true grass, it would be one, a monocot. But the tops look just like grass seedlings when they come up. And then by the end of the first year, they've made a nice little corm or a little bulb that we can hold over. These are, does anyone know this one? Anybody tell? It's an old photo on the right. It's the same plant on the right as on the left. Yes, you'll be seeing it. That's skunk cabbage. So that's the foliage of skunk cabbage, and you can see from in the photo on the right, it's telling you something about the distribution or the dispersal of the seed of skunk cabbage, and you can kind of picture that the mature seed heads or the fruits that this plant forms are not going far; they're dispersing right where they are in the mud. That's a strategy for that plant. And then on the left are two little germinating seedlings. It's another tough one to carry on in the nursery. We like to germinate and we try to grow them, but they really resist nursery cultivation. They just want to be in a giant deep mud pit. And we try to simulate those things, but at some point, you know, it's just, this is just to show a lot of the habitat where skunk cabbage grows is getting infested with garlic mustard. It has been for many years, but they tend to share a lot of that habitat overlap between those species. So will that, you know, over time, will that wear down the skunk cabbage? I don't know. It's a pretty durable plant, but at some level, anything that germinates does need a space to grow, and it needs a little surface area. Yeah.
Just a question on skunk cabbage. So, you know, the first photo you showed earlier of like the initial emergence, kind of what's happening right now in the woods.
Yeah.
That's the flower. You're saying?
The one I showed like a half hour or something.
Yeah.
Yeah, purplish one.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is the flower.
Okay.
Exactly. And then this is the foliage. And so if this one were flowering right now, that flower structure would be like right here on the ground level.
Right.
And that flower structure is kind of unusual. It's called a spathe and spadix, which is basically a bract and a club head on the inside of the bract. So like Jack in the Pulpits do that. There's a few things that do that, but it's really just another form of a compound inflorescence. And in that case, what is supposed to maybe be the attractant instead of a big showy flower is that bract that, you know, I don't think with pollinators, they're gonna worry about if it looks like a flower. It's just a question if they see it, you know, and notice it.
It smells.
And they smell it, yeah, they smell those, yeah. And they also, those particular ones generate heat, which attracts insects in the winter. In the end of the winter, like we're in right now. So a few ways to attract pollinators. These are some of the flowering dogwoods, native flowering dogwood, Cornus Florida. We grow these from seed and they carry on okay, but they are slow growers. And usually by the time they're this big in the nursery, people are willing to take them home as little pet dogwoods. And the problem is that we never get a chance to grow them up big. But it's great. I love when people want to take them home small and baby them. The first nursery that I really worked for in California, they never wanted to sell anything. They wanted to keep everything. Sometimes I think about that now. Now I see why they got that way, because I do get attached to things in the nursery, but in general, it's more fun to see them go out and find homes. But sometimes you have a specimen in the nursery and you get attached to them. You get attached to some of the individuals. The native flowering dogwood is a great tree. It's fussy. It has some disease issues. It's a fussy habitat wise plant. And so you do see a lot of Kusa dogwood, the Korean Cornus Kusa. Tends to be a little more sort of problem free than the native dogwood. And that's one of the reasons it's become more popular. But this plant has a lot of character. The Cornus Florida is a very cool character plant. Very cool. Just a few more seedling photos, the elderberries. A lot of times people may not really think about them until they're in fruit. So I like to make sure people get to see the flowers, which are a zillion per head and just adorable. And then the fruits, when people sort of register the plant on the landscape, you can see, obviously easy to see them. When we first really grew our first large crop of elderberry from seed, they all did this. And I thought something was wrong and we lost them. And then they all just sprouted these gorgeous new shoots from the base. And then we thought, all right, well, we weren't going to sell them the first year anyway. So we learned something about them. And that's really how they like to grow, is that first year, they're so fast growing. I don't think there's really that much wood in those stems and they just don't hold up over the winter. But by year 2, they can be 3 feet tall. And at that point, they're ready for winter. So that's a 1-year elderberry cleaned up for show, and then showing you where the new growth is coming from, all sort of off that base. And that top stem on the left, the stem that had sort of died back, just doesn't have any structure to it. So pretty fun to see. Yeah.
So are you just pruning back that first year growth, like in second or third year?
Yeah, we would, I mean, cosmetically, but
Yeah.
it would, you know, like in nature, that would just rot away by probably summer. But we would probably clean those off, but as long as it's dead tissue, we would just cut back to before it was live tissue, so we just leave a little stub. In general, if you're dealing with pruning stuff, I mean, sometimes you got to cut live wood, and that's part of what pruning is, but when you're cutting off dead wood like that, I generally would try to not let the plant really know. Wouldn't really want to, like for a young plant, I wouldn't want to do too much cutting right down at the bottom like that. But I mean, these are as tough as can be. These elderberries, I don't know if you could kill them if you tried. And they germinate nicely. They're a good plant. Rubus odoratus, our flowering raspberry. These like to grow in, well, they'll really grow almost anywhere, but where we see them growing around Ithaca is in the gorges, on the cliffs, and the shale piles, at the bottom of the cliffs. And also in full shade. So if you have a spot that's full shade under some heavy canopy cover of trees, they're just like a giant 4-foot ground cover. Very cool plant.
How can you, I collected a couple of their seeds last year and
Yeah.
put in an envelope again. But, you know, what do I do now?
They would be one you probably just want to stick. Well, now if you have them now,
Mhm.
at this point, you probably just throw them in a little tray of soil and treat them
See
like
what
they're
happens.
ready and see what happens.
Okay.
I think that's one that we do 90 days on in the fridge. So in the future, if you want to try and take a couple of fruits off in the summer, put them in a little, store them in a little Ziploc in the fridge. The challenge and the reason we clean a lot of the seed before we store it is you don't just want to throw it in storage right away, because now you're talking about, if you're collecting that in September, you've got October, November, December, January, February, March, April, 6 to 7 months before you might want to sow it. And most of them will germinate in 90 days, 100 days. So now you're talking about something that's gonna germinate in your fridge in January, and then what? So, you wanna time it and work back. So if you say, I'm not gonna mess with any of this till May, you might not wanna put it in your fridge till February. That's why we would clean that seed and dry it and store it. And you get into some things that don't like to be stored dry, and that's where you get into some complications. But in general, this plant, the only drawback with this plant, well, there's two. One is the deer tend to like it,
Oh, it's.
and two is that it can be rampant. It can get rampant, but I love it, putting it under like a dry maple grove or something where people tell us nothing will grow. We tell them whitewood aster, which is that first little tray, Rubus odoratus, those two things will grow in the closet. I mean, they don't really need any light. So if you have a little light, they're gonna be happy. And sometimes they will outgrow the space. But in general, with landscape problems, a plant that outgrows its space is a good problem to have. If it's a spot where nothing will grow. And these are seedlings of Rubus odoratus, again, yellow tag. So for us, if it's a plant that grows locally, we really don't want to get the seed from somewhere else. If it's a plant that doesn't grow locally, like echinacea, then I don't care as much because there is no local echinacea populations for us to worry about. If it's a plant that doesn't grow in North America, like like lilacs, then I don't really care where they come from. At that point, I'm trying to either, if we don't grow them ourselves, we're going to try to find them from a grower that I like, who I like their practices. Whose practices I think are clean and healthy, and they're close enough to us that they're not coming from Oregon. But when it's a plant that does exist locally where we are, that's when we really try to make sure we're not bringing in seed source from anywhere else. And this is a good example of that I would never want to bring in Rubus odoratus from anywhere else, because the most beautiful, vigorous populations I've seen anywhere are in the Finger Lakes. And that's why we want to grow them from there for sure.
Oh,
Those are the milkweeds. If people have heard about the milkweeds, but not really fallen in love with them yet, this is aside from the butterflies, this is one reason to fall in love with them, is they're beautiful flowers. This is as fragrant as any flower we have in the US. The common milkweed, Asclepias syriaca. And that can be a little bit rampant in the landscape too. You know,
yeah, we will never do.
people buy that in the nursery, and I always tell them, you sure you know what you're getting into? You know, make sure you put it far away. And they would say, oh, that won't be a problem for me. But you know, it does spread. It's a spreading plant. Whereas the swamp milkweed on the left is not a spreader, it's a clumping perennial. So it will stay where you put it. And the butterfly milkweed on the right is also a clumping plant that will stay where you put it. One of the hardest plants to grow and keep happy is this, because it just doesn't want to have wet clay on the roots. It doesn't want to be soggy, wants really good drainage, sandy soils, gravelly soils is where it really does well. Yeah,
I have to say, we have a lot of clay soil.
yeah,
It's not usually wet, does get fairly dry, but our butterfly milk.
Does well.
Have been fabulous.
That's great.
The place where we got them. Our original seeding was rocky shale and like near 40 backside of Clark Reds.
yeah.
We collect our first seed.
Yeah.
Happy, it's seeded itself all over 2 or 3 other, I don't know, half a dozen other places in our
Yeah,
yard.
there's a fair amount of it right there where you're talking
It's
about.
okay.
And I don't know if it's all, I assume some of that is native and some of it might have been seeded as a mine reclamation project at some point around there.
I wouldn't think so when we got it.
But I'm sure there's native populations of it right around it. And, you know, what it seems to want the most is dry. And especially in the winter, that's when we find that this plant, for us, dies in captivity, is when it's in pots and it's sitting a little wet in the wintertime. These are just some of the seed heads of the milkweeds. Pretty plants. Milkweeds are a great American group. Our species are a great group. They really are. A few more of them. The sumacs. I like to promote the sumac. It's the only shrub, it's the only native shrub where you can see birds feeding on it
Really?
in June of the year after it bloomed. So you're talking about when we see, like this spring, you will see birds eating sumac that was last year's growth, last year's flower, last year's fruit. It's the only shrub that we have that does that. So as the birds are coming back through in the spring and even into as late as June, they will be eating fruit that formed in the fall of last year. And it's the only shrub that provides that. And it's a beautiful plant. You just don't want it by the front door. That's all.
It's kind of like a tree too, isn't it?
It can be tree-like, and sometimes in the woods around us, you'll see old sumacs in the woods
Yeah.
that presumably were there before the forests grew up around them. So it's telling you something about the successional stages of the woods there. This is our blue flag iris, nice little knee-high iris, grows wet. Will grow anywhere you put it, but it likes to grow in some moist soils or a little bit of water. You can grow it in a few inches of standing water, no problem. But you can also grow it in an average dry garden bed. Easy to divide. The irises are great for that. You can divide them. This is tulip poplar seed gathered along a little lake shore on the ground. There should be thousands of seedlings of those in the spring, but they're hard to germinate. Very hard plant to grow. Tulip tree. These are some sycamore seedlings on the right, and on the left, real baby seedlings, like probably first week of germination. And then fall of year one on the right, where they're starting to show a little color. Slow grower when they're like that, and then when you put those in a pot, they'll put on a couple of feet of growth a year after they get going. That's the sycamores. Spice bush, Lindera benzoin. On the right, you can see, same like the elderberry, sometimes it's fun to clean that root system off and show people what it looks like. So much more fibrous root system. And this is a dioecious plant. There are males and females, but not on the same plant, which is unusual. So some plants will produce fruit and some are males and don't produce fruit. They just make pollen. And this is another hard one for us to keep going because they sell when people find out we have spice bush. We actually have a waiting list every year in the nursery for spice bush. It's amazing. We're so happy that people love this plant, but we'd love to get to the point where we had enough of them that we could let them grow out to like full-size landscape plants. That will never happen. And that's the spice bush swallowtail that finds them in the nursery. This cutie over here. And that was my son when he was younger, and he used to let me tell him, go stand in front of that plant. He doesn't do that anymore. This is sassafras, sort of a dry upland species that we have scattered about up here, and much more common as you go south into New Jersey, Maryland, Virginia, Delaware down there. And that's where we used to do a lot of collecting when I was working down there. This is a harder plant to collect here locally. We've tried to grow seedlings, but it's hard to find seed for this plant here. But really cute plant. Pagoda dogwood. When we were talking before about how it's hard to find good little trees for our part of the world, pagoda dogwood is a nice one. This is Cornus alternifolia. Has that sort of plain branching, and then the red buds. Redbud is one of those plants like echinacea that there's debate about whether it's where it's native, in particular in New York or not. I would say it's native in Pennsylvania and Ohio. So at that point, whether it's native in New York or not, I don't want to say it's splitting hairs, but it's a regional plant. Whether it's locally occurring or not, it's hard to say. It has this cool epicormic branching, which means that or cauliflory, sometimes it's called, where the flowers will come right off the wood without being on stems. And this plant is pretty much an upland species, so for dry sites, not for wet lawns. And this is just a few examples of some of how these things work in nature. This was when we had a truck down to our mechanics for too long. And I went down to check on it, and there was an increment growing in it out of the rocker panel. So, but opportunistic in nature. So all the work that we do to make this happen in the nursery, this stuff really is just going on all around us all the time. These are cottonwoods and sycamores just filling cracks in the ledges around the gorges by the thousands.
Wow.
Most of those will die, but they don't know that yet. So it's look like that. I guess those are just cottonwoods. Maybe some of those are aspens. These are silver maples growing in a ditch by the side of the road. really not in the ditch. They're really growing in the gravel. It was interesting. They're really growing right on the edge of the asphalt sort of cinders there. And then on the right in the nursery. So we're just trying to fool these plants really in a nursery environment. That's really all we're trying to do. Aurelia racemosa is a fun one that we've been growing recently. We collect this seed in the gorges and there's tons and tons of seed. It's an abundant producer and easy to grow. Some of the small maples, the Acer spicatum, which is really like a shrub maple, which is called mountain maple. It's a beautiful little plant. And then Pennsylvania, the Acer pennsylvanica, the striped maple, beautiful little plant as well. These are small trees in the genus, same genus as the big maples. And then just a couple of pictures of some of the plugs that we grow, which I brought a few so you can see, but the grasses really like to be grown in that size. These are some of the older big ones that we used to grow. So really, as far as sort of a take-home message for some of this stuff, I think it's important that we remember what these plants are that we're interested in and what they're doing in our environment, what roles they're playing in our environment, and why they're different here compared to native plants in other parts of the country, which is they're adapted to the conditions here. And that is a core principle with working with native plants, is that they have a regional identity and they have a regional role, and that's in their regional DNA. And so that's why growing plants locally is important if you're interested in those plants. And that's also why it's not, in my opinion, not ideal to be growing those plants in the existing larger scale model where horticulture takes place. Is because their system really is not about those things, and it's really about not allowing those things to happen. And that's really the key for the distinctions that we're talking about. So I appreciate everybody sticking around on a nice day, and I'm happy to answer questions too. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. We got questions? Well, there's questions from the Zoom. Q&A, 8 questions.
8 questions, okay.
Do you want me to read those, or you want to read them? I believe you, but I don't see where they're at. Does anybody have any questions in here? Feel free.
Are you growing hemlock for sale?
No, at the moment, we're not. Partly because of the problems that hemlock is having, and partly because of the problems we had growing it. But when we planted them out on landscape jobs, it didn't do well. It just didn't.
Another tree I would love is a wild cherry, choke cherry, and I had one in my yard that died, but it was just a beautiful tree, and I don't know if there.
The big white inflorescences.
It was just like.
Yeah, I mean, there's the black cherry, which is a tall tree, native tree, big Prunus serratna. And then there's the Prunus virginiana, the choke cherry, shrubby, a little more aggressive. We do grow the big cherry, but not the shrub one.
Place do ferns have in?
Oh, that's a good question. Ferns grow from spores. They reproduce from spores. They don't make seed. As a result of that, anyone who's good at growing plants from seed, when you ask them, do you want to try to grow plants from spores? Usually they're like, no. It's harder. It's much harder, much harder. So you tend to find specialist fern growers, and some of those are small scale, and we'll grow them from spores in flasks and beakers. You also have most of the bulk fern industry is by tissue culture by a few huge companies. One of them that used to be in Texas, I assume they still are, and they would ship little baby ferns out to every garden center or nursery in the country. So you kind of would have the same thing in that scenario where it's all the same, they're cloned. There used to be a woman in Hartwick that was growing ferns from spore.
Fernery.
The fernery, yeah. It's tricky. Yeah, go ahead.
You were talking about how it takes eons, sometimes millions of years for certain plants to kind of grow into that ecology and adapt to it.
Yeah.
And they're tuned in with their seeds and whatever. Well, with the intense changes in temperature and less moisture, or let's say, I don't want to use the word climate change.
Yeah.
I just want to say all these different conditions, I
Yeah.
think flooding or fires or the whatever. What do you think is Are plants gonna be able to adapt that fast?
Yeah, it's a good question. In general, I think they are. In general, I think they are. I think what you'll see is some species would be slower to react, harder to react, have longer generation cycles where they don't reproduce as quickly. Those would be the ones I would assume would have the most trouble adapting, but you know, I don't want to say that things are happening the same as they always have. However, there have been lots of examples through geologic time of massive changes in environment and climate and weather and conditions. And we don't know which plants we've lost. Well, I mean, we do to some degrees, we have a fossil record, but we don't know what other casualties there have been. But we do know that there used to be things like avocado trees and palm trees and willows and even more lush species that would grow in the deserts. We know that from the fossil record. So those plants at some point managed to escape the deserts and get into wetter zones. Does that mean every plant will be able to do that now? No, probably not, but it's definitely things they've done before. You know, they've definitely done before. I definitely do not think the answer is for people to start predicting which plants would do better here, and start moving them around. That we have no track record of that ever working, but we do have lots and lots of track record of plants sorting that out on their own through the fossil record. So a species that might have been super abundant over a large part of the country may now be reduced to a smaller part of the country, but that's basically how that works, you know, and it's hard not to look at it and say this plant is now under stress and reduced. But, you know, whether we used to have, the East Coast is a harder place to do it because the conditions have been the same, more similar over time. But if you look at places out west, they've had huge expansions and contractions of things that like humid, wet, rich environments into the desert zones and then back out of the desert zones. And it happens. I don't know. I mean, I certainly don't know exactly what's going to happen, but I would put my money on the plants figuring it out better than we could figure it out. That would be my answer.
Okay, we have a couple questions from the Zoom. What type of medium would you suggest for starting seeds?
Well, there are lots of commercial mixes that are called germination mixes. And they're all like maybe have subtle differences, but they'll all work fine. Anything that's considered a germination mix would work fine if you were to buy like one bag of that. If you wanted to make your own, you'd probably use some kind of fine potting soil mixed with a little bit of perlite or sand. So you get a little mix of drainage and soil moisture retention. But a lot of the commercial germination mixes are going to be that. So I would say, unless you're picky, just use something fairly generic that is considered germination mix.
Okay, and another question, is it necessary to clean seed that will be sown outdoors to replicate a natural process?
No, I would say no.
Okay. I'm never sure if a seed needs to be covered with soil or should be left on the surface. How can I get that information? I think
Well,
YouTube has stuff.
I was gonna say, yeah, I would say you could Google a species, like each species, if you Google germination requirements for a species, it ought to include light. Light should be a parameter. If it's an issue for that species, it will be as important to include that as it is for how long it needs stratification.
Okay. Plan on making, I think he means I plan on making a wildflower meadow by spreading seed on a prepared area. Do you have any tips of how to deter wildlife, slugs, birds, deer, etc. from eating the seedlings?
Well, it's a funny question because one of the jokes that we always make about habitat gardening and all these things is like people want that, you know, but they don't want mice and snakes. Not that slugs eating your seedlings is what you should be striving for, but you know, I think at some point you're relying on your own common sense and attention to detail at that point where yeah, you can chicken wire, you know, you can use chicken wire to fence out small critters and deer fence, obviously, but for the little stuff and birds eating your seedlings, I mean, sometimes people will use like a little goose netting or deer netting over the top of a small space. when we're storing seed outside in like storage boxes for stratification, we'll use hardware cloth in some cases over there for storage. Once things start to grow, though, all that has to come off and you have to let them grow.
When can a 4-foot tall volunteer tulip tree be transplanted? And same question for a 16-inch tall white oak.
Well, generally when they're dormant. Yeah, generally when they're dormant, the 4-foot, the answer for when the 4-foot tall tulip tree should be transplanted would be when it was smaller, I guess. I wouldn't really probably expect that to survive unless you had a tree spade. You could, so it's always better when they're dormant. When they're that big, your odds are better when they're dormant. For the little oak, you could probably do it any time of year before it gets much bigger. That's probably still a safe size. Always water them when you move them.
Okay, when monoclonals bloom and put out seed year after year, is there any genetic change that happens?
Monoclonals, I'm assuming they're referring to a clone thing or cultivar. Yeah, monoclonal I think of as COVID, right? It's not antibody. Yeah. So read that again.
When monoclonals bloom and put out seed year after year, is there any genetic change that happens? Maybe they're referring to a cultivar.
Right, so if you have a clone or a cultivar, so those plants can either definitely or sometimes breed with their species if that species exists nearby. So if you have a clone, let's say of a Monarda, and there's a wild population of Monarda near enough by, you might get those two to breed and cross. And in that case, sure, you're going to get some mixing back in, but the scenario that I'm describing right there is kind of a long shot in that case. So the only way those plants won't change unless they have sexual reproduction with a wild population nearby. That's the only way that those clones will change their DNA at all.
Okay. And can you dig up native elderberry shrubs from one place on a property and transplant to another wet area during the spring?
Sure, as long as they're not too big, but sure, you can. You just generally when we're transplanting something like that, we'd probably cut it back so that there isn't as much top to it, and then dig it up and then stick it in the ground wet. And you'll know if you're breaking too many roots, you probably have to dig deeper and wider. But it'll handle some roots getting torn and cut. That should work, unless you're talking about like a giant mature one, but a young one, it should work.
And that's not something you should wait until it's dormant? Or-
Well, I'm assuming by that question, they want to do it now.
Yes.
So I would say go for it in that case, but probably have a better chance if it's dormant. But if it's a fairly young, knee-high or something, waist-high elderberry, it'll probably survive. They're pretty tough.
Okay. Have you considered selling plugs? If one has a large project, it can be cost prohibitive to buy live plants.
Yes, I mean, the answer to that is that yes, I used to grow lots of plugs, but it's a huge, the plug industry is a huge separate industry within the nursery industry, and generally we can't compete with that market because those nurseries ship all over the place. So for anyone that's doing a big enough project where they need thousands of plugs, that's just not our market.
And the last question on here.
One more after that.
Oh, one more of that. Where is a good source of local seeds?
You got to collect them, I would say. There's no local seed sellers in our area. And I think you have to collect your own. I do. I think that's a good thing to learn. If you're interested enough in those plants to really want to grow them, it's not that big a step to learn how to collect the seed.
Okay. Was there one after that? I can't see.
Yes, last one is, can you recommend a native shrub for shade, not too moist? Currently has burning bush, which doesn't even turn red because there isn't enough sun.
And they would prefer one no taller than 4 feet, but can be proved.
Yeah.
The list just got small down to 0. No, yeah, it's a little hard. I probably could come up with a few names of things, but, it's just hard to do that on the spot, you know, the things that, and specifically for that category, native shade shrubs are the smallest of all the mental lists that we keep, native shrubs for shade. Especially that the deer don't eat, and because that's such a hard niche to solve. We get a lot of requests for that niche. Because most people have voids if they have that habitat, and so you're really talking about a list of native shrubs that's deer resistant and can tolerate almost full shade and doesn't get too big. Yeah, the deer eat it most of the time. But maybe Rubus odoratus, but the deer tend to eat it. Lindera benzoin maybe would be good. So those would be the 3, but you know, there's probably 1 or 2 more. And then there are those things that you might see in the wild that nurseries don't grow. There's some of the things in the rhododendron family that might fit that description, but nurseries aren't really growing. Witch hazel gets a little bigger than that. Also, the deer tend to eat it. That's a very, very tough list. There's a reason you haven't found anything in that category, I'd say.
Is the 9-bark a native?
Limebark's native and it's a great shrub. I don't really think of it as a deep shade plant. It probably will survive there and just get scraggly. I've never really heard any great ecological value in the 9-bark. I've always wondered and asked around and never heard anyone tell me that they know for sure what ecological role that plant has. Whether it's something eating the seed or pollinating, I'm just not sure.
Is burning bush invasive?
Generally, yeah, it's considered invasive, yeah. It's on the New York State do not sell list.
Yeah.
And we like to remove it whenever we're working on a property. But there are some cases where someone's relying entirely on burning bush for their privacy. And if they're in a deer neighborhood, it's pretty hard to put privacy shrubs back in. So sometimes we just tell people, keep your burning bush. But in general, if someone's asking us to sort of remodel a landscape more for aesthetic reasons, that always comes up. We never work around it unless it's the only thing between you and the neighbor, because usually in those settings, it's very hard to plant back privacy that you'll be happy with for many, many years, or it's fence time at that point.
One more quick one. How can we know which shrubs at Plantsmen are seed grown versus cutting?
Well, the short answer is we grow really nothing from cuttings. But every now and then we'll experiment with a crop of cuttings to see if we can do it. We're just not good at growing cuttings. We're good at growing things from seed. And so pretty much everything we grow in our yellow tag program is seed. It's all about the seed. Part of that is because as a practice, we don't really want to rely on cutting production, because cutting production, like tissue culture, means everyone is the identical same genetics. If you're taking cuttings, it is a form of cloning. Now, do I think that occasionally growing a plant from cuttings is a big deal? No, I don't. It's nothing like the pervasiveness of the cultivar industry. If you want to grow some plants from cuttings, it's fun. You can make it work. That's great. But in general, we're more successful with seed. We like to work with seed, and the yellow tag program is really for us about using seed. So that's really why we do that.
Is there a place to get my soil testers? I have a lot of moss growing in them.
Usually that's cooperative extension will do that stuff.
Yeah, or you just said get for non-buffer extension, and they will send you a soil test kit. They'll send you a kit where you can go pick one out, big range, pick one out on the Calendar Road office.
Okay, great, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't have a lot of moss.
Yeah, they'll be
Yeah.
at the farmer's market, they'll be tabling in the farmer's market on Saturday, and they separate it in the market.
Exactly.
That's good. That's easy.
That's all easy.
Yes.
Hi, do you or anybody in here know anybody who removes fragmites from like a retention pond? Is there an answer to that?
Usually that's done with equipment, like machinery,
Okay,
like an excavator.
Really?
Yeah, because those, you can't really get that by hand. This one.
Okay,
It's kind of like Japanese knotweed in terms of the scale.
okay, you have to dig down, so.
You do have to go pretty deep. Now, it's driven by hydrology, so the Phragmites will only grow at a certain water depth. And as soon as the water gets deep enough, like cattails, you won't see them all the way out in the water.
Okay.
So sometimes what people will do is after they will try to get the Phragmites out, but also while the equipment's there, try to make that area deeper. The
Okay.
deeper water shouldn't allow it to grow. But as long as you have some Phragmites left, it's pretty good at trying to grow back.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Thank you.
that's a problem. Yeah, it's not a good one. Thank you.
What is that flower?
That is Monarda fistulosa, wild bergamot. So it's not a pink scarlet bee balm. It's a species of Monarda. It grows on, you see that really nicely on the median on 81 between like Lafayette and Syracuse. Growing where the butterfly milkweed grows, it'll grow out there. And it grows around central New York, but it's definitely a hot, dry site species that we use when people ask for like pollinator gardens that are drought tolerant. It's one of the things we use. Fistulosa, yeah. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.
Feel free to